Losing a leg on an 18th century pirate ship was safer than in London's finest royal hospital. This is not a myth. It is a statistical fact that shatters our entire understanding of medicine. Picture two scenes. The first, a deck awash with blood and salt water, where a carpenter with a wood saw acts as the surgeon. The second, a London hospital ward, where a certified physician operates in relative order and cleanliness. The first scene, one of primal horror, more often ended in survival. The second, a scene of civilization, led to a slow death from infection. How is this possible? How did these butchers with saws achieve results that were beyond the reach of medical academy graduates? This paradox holds the entire truth about pirate surgery. The key to this mystery lies in the answers to two fundamental questions. The first concerns the man. How could a ship's carpenter, accustomed to working with wood rather than human flesh, achieve better results on a rocking deck with crude tools than a doctor in a stable hospital? This is a question of credentials versus pragmatism. The second question concerns the system. What invisible killer reigned in Europe's best hospitals, claiming the lives of 9 out of 10 amputation patients, while the filthy, rum and tar-soaked deck of a pirate ship somehow offered protection? The answer lies not in what the pirates did, but in what they didn't do, and the most gruesome details of their practice will turn out to be the most important. We will examine pirate amputation not as an act of barbarism, but as a brutal yet flawlessly logical system. Over the next 20 minutes, we will journey from instinctive horror at the carpenter's saw to a cold admiration for its effectiveness. We will prove that every step of this bloody ritual was not random cruelty, but the only correct decision under the circumstances. Right now, you see only the cold, harsh winter of this practice, but we will show you how the spring of logic and the summer of astonishing survival grew from it. The image of a butcher will be replaced by that of a pragmatic genius whose system simply worked. Here is our investigation. In 5 minutes, we will dive into the chaos of a naval battle to understand why amputation was the only option. The deck, littered with wooden splinters, transformed into a field operating room in mere seconds. In 10 minutes, you will witness the brutal but brilliant 3-second amputation technique that was the key to survival. We will study every tool in the ship's surgeon's arsenal, and toward the end, we will reveal the ultimate secret, the one ingredient that accidentally made a pirate operation safer than a hospital procedure. It is this ingredient that explains the paradox with which we began. What could be more terrifying than a direct hit from a cannonball? The sound of the impact tearing through the air, the crack of the oak hull, the screams. The cannonball seems like the obvious killer. It shatters bones and tears muscles, creating a wound that requires immediate intervention. But the cannonball was merely the trigger. The real weapon of mass destruction was the thousands of wooden splinters that flew like shrapnel. A single 24-pound cannonball striking the hull could create over 1,000 fragments. One clean wound instantly became hundreds of small, dirty ones that were impossible to clean. This total contamination started a countdown. The surgeon had minutes to outrun infection, and the only way to win this race was to cut off the entire affected battlefield. This decision had to be made in seconds, but making it was only the first move. Why did the mere darkening of the skin strike more terror into pirates than the sight of an enemy flag? The answer is one word: gangrene. This is not just tissue death from bacteria and lack of blood flow. For a pirate, it was a visible death timer. The threat was so systemic that it was built into the ship's economy. In Captain Bartholomew Roberts's articles, the loss of a right arm was valued at 500 pieces of 8, the equivalent of a sailor's annual salary. This wasn't accident insurance. It was a prepayment for the inevitable. The blackness slowly creeping up the skin was not a symptom, but a final countdown. And in this game with death, the surgeon had exactly one move left: remove the piece from the board. But the entire strategy fails if you don't have a board to play on. How did a leg torn off by a cannonball offer a better chance of survival than a single bullet wound to the abdomen? This paradox explains the brutal logic of pirate medicine. Any wound to the torso meant peritonitis, an infection that medicine couldn't handle for another 200 years. For such casualties, The surgeon had only rum and sympathy. But a limb injury, no matter how horrific, was a local catastrophe. It could be physically separated from the body, isolating the threat. It was like fighting a fire on a ship. A stomach wound was a fire in the powder magazine, an uncontrollable disaster. A leg wound was a fire in a single cabin. The solution was brutal but simple. Seal the hatch and let it burn out to save the ship. This cold logic determined who to save, but it didn't yet determine where to do it. The wounded man lies on the deck. Blood mixes with seawater and gunpowder residue. The gangrene clock is ticking. Logic suggests carrying him to a cabin where there is light and relative cleanliness. But pirates almost never did this. The operation was performed right there, on the deck, amidst the screams and smoke. This was not savagery, but a key principle of the system. Time spent on transport was time gained by the infection. The surgeon knelt directly on the blood-slick deck, and speed was more important than anything, more important than comfort, cleanliness, and even precision. So the stage is set in chaos. Now let's look at the actors and their grim props. How can you keep a scalpel on target when the deck is shifting beneath your feet? Common sense suggests brute force. The strongest sailors hold the patient in a death grip, while the surgeon braces against a mast, trying to catch a moment of calm. This is a picture of man battling the elements. But an experienced surgeon didn't fight the ship's roll. He synchronized with it. He would inhale with the rise of a wave, pausing, and make the precise cut on the exhale as the ship descended, using gravity as his ally. It was a dance with death, performed to the rhythm of the ocean. And the identity of the performer is the next paradox. Most often, this person was the ship's carpenter or cook, someone who had been fixing a mast or butchering a pig the day before. The choice seems pragmatic. They had saws and knives and weren't afraid of blood. But their main advantage was not what they knew, but what they didn't know. Their minds were not clouded by erroneous medical theories about miasmas and humoral balance. Their approach was purely mechanical. A shattered leg was like a broken mass to them. You don't treat it, you cut it off and replace it. This ignorance was a shield against the fallacies of the era. Their minds were clear of false theories. But what did they use to clean their instruments? The answer is obvious. Rum. The patient was given a bottle to dull the pain, and the surgeon wiped his instruments with a rag soaked in the same rum. The myth is that rum was an anesthetic, but the numbers debunk this. Achieving surgical anesthesia would require over a liter of strong rum, administered quickly, a dose that would more likely kill the patient than relieve the pain. The real, albeit unintentional, effect was different. By wiping their tools with it, pirates performed a primitive form of disinfection. The alcohol killed some of the bacteria. Rum didn't save them from the pain, but it could save them from infection. Pain was a guarantee. But the instruments that inflicted it were not always homemade. It is commonly believed that pirates used whatever was at hand, a carpenter's saw, a cook's knife. But this is only part of the truth. Professional surgical kits were one of the most coveted prizes during a boarding. Among the treasures found on Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, were not only cannons, but also urethral syringes. Pirates were not just improvisers, but also collectors who understood that a good instrument was more valuable than gold. And so, the operating room is ready. The surgeon is in place. It's time to open his bag, which might contain anything from a rusty saw to a silver-plated scalpel taken from a Royal Navy doctor. How does a wood saw differ from a bone saw? A surgical saw is thin, light, with fine teeth for a clean cut. A carpenter's saw is heavy, coarse, with large teeth that tear tissue. Logic dictates choosing the surgical instrument, but pirate practice refutes this. The weight and aggressive teeth of a carpenter's saw allowed a femur to be sawn through in 3 strokes, in 3 to 5 seconds of agony. Working with a fine surgical saw could take up to a minute. The choice was dictated not by the desire for a perfect wound, but by the need to end the unbearable pain as quickly as possible. It was better to survive with a ragged stump than to die of shock during a neat operation. The saw solved the bone problem, but first the muscles had to be dealt with, and here pirates showed remarkable foresight. Why complicate things? It would seem one knife is enough to make a circular cut through the flesh to the bone. First, a large amputation knife was used to quickly slice through skin and muscle, but then another tool appeared, a long, thin, double-edged knife called a catling. Its function was counterintuitive. It wasn't used to cut, but to carefully scrape the muscles away from the bone for several centimeters above the saw line. This wasn't cruelty, but brilliant foresight. By leaving a clean section of bone, the surgeon created a cuff of skin and flesh. After the amputation, this cuff could be used to cover the wound, which promoted healing and the formation of a proper stump. They were thinking not just about survival in the moment, but about life after. But none of this would have mattered without solving the main problem: the fountain of blood. What simple mechanical device saved more lives at sea than any doctor? The primitive tourniquet, made of rope and a stick, had been known for a long time, but it was unreliable and often failed to completely compress the femoral artery. Everything changed around 1718 with the invention of the screw tourniquet. This was a metal bracket with a pad and a screw. It allowed for immense, even, and most importantly, controllable pressure. It was the screw tourniquet that made amputations on major arteries possible. It gave the surgeon precious minutes of a dry operating field, turning almost certain death into an operation with a chance of success. The tourniquet only stopped the blood temporarily, but as soon as it was removed, the countdown began again, and for that, the pirates had their own fiery answer. So the picture is complete. The tourniquet is tightened until the limb is white, stopping the pulse. Knives for flesh and bone lie ready. The saw awaits its turn. At first glance, this is just a sequence of actions: tighten, cut, saw. But it was not a sequence. It was a single, well-oiled mechanism, almost a ritual. The surgeon and his assistants acted as one team, where each instrument appeared in his hand at the right second. We have studied the tools. We understand the philosophy that dictated their choice. Now that the arsenal is assembled, it's time to see how all these elements merge into one swift and brutal symphony of steel and flesh, performed in 3 acts. The first act, a wave of steel. The most common amputation method was called the circular technique. The surgeon would take a large knife and in one swift, continuous motion cut through the skin and muscles down to the bone. But this simplicity is deceptive. An experienced surgeon made the incision not perpendicularly, but at an angle, creating a surplus of skin and flesh. It's like rolling up a sleeve before work. After the amputation, this sleeve could be used to cover the sharp bone, forming a smooth stump ready for a prosthesis. They were thinking several steps ahead. The path to the bone is cleared in a single second. Now, the instrument whose sound was the soundtrack of agony comes into play. The second act. The saw meets the bone. The patient is conscious. His screams tear through the air. What is the surgeon's most important tool at this moment? It seems to be physical strength to saw through the femur faster, but that's a mistake. The key quality was a psychological armor. The surgeon had to become deaf to his comrade's suffering, perceiving his convulsions as a technical inconvenience. His face remained impassive while his hands, drenched in blood, made quick, precise movements. Any sympathy, any hesitation, led to delay, and delay led to death. This was a battle not only with flesh, but also with his own humanity. The limb is severed, but the body is now an open vessel, with life draining from it. The third act, sealing the wound. As soon as the tourniquet is loosened, the arteries will turn the stump into a fountain. The most advanced method of the time was ligation, tying off each vessel with a silk thread. But pirates rarely used it. It required perfect light, immobility, cleanliness, and time, 4 things that didn't exist on a ship. The rejection of ligation was not a sign of backwardness, but another example of brutal pragmatism. They chose not the most elegant method, but the most reliable one. Instead of risking a delicate thread in the dark and on a rolling ship, they chose the brute force of fire. The operation took less than a minute. The surgeon now faced 2 tasks: stop the bleeding and close the wound to protect it from filth. Logic suggests these are 2 separate steps. But the pirate system was more efficient. They solved both problems with a single action. This was the most painful, most shocking, but also the most crucial moment of the entire procedure, the moment that turned the patient into either a survivor or a corpse. It was time to seal the gates of hell, and for this, pirates used the two most terrifying tools in their arsenal, a red-hot iron and boiling tar. The metal, heated to a cherry-red glow, touched the open wound. The sizzle and smell of burning flesh were the sounds of salvation. This method, cauterization, had been known for a long time. The extreme temperature instantly coagulated the blood and sealed the vessels. It seemed that any object from the brazier would do, but this was not improvisation. It was a system. On ships, they used special cauterizing irons, flat ones for the surface, pointed ones for major arteries. Several were heated at once for continuous application, and here is the main, unconscious effect. The red-hot iron was sterile. It created not just a scab on the wound, but a sterile barrier. This was the first line of defense against gangrene, but the surgeon had a second, even more total method. The smell of survival on a pirate ship was not the smell of rum, but the acrid, industrial scent of boiling tar. The logic seemed straightforward. If tar seals a leak in the ship, it will stop a leak in a man. But the practice was far more horrific. The surgeon didn't just coat the wound. He completely submerged the stump in a cauldron of boiling liquid. Unlike the iron, which acted locally, the tar penetrated every crevice, instantly sealing hundreds of small vessels. It was a total solution. After cooling, the tar created a hard, waterproof, and antiseptic plug. It worked like a wax seal on a letter, completely isolating the living tissue from the filthy world. So, which to choose? The precision of the red-hot iron or the total coverage of boiling tar? This was not a matter of preference, but of cold anatomical calculation. For amputations of the arm or lower leg, where there were fewer arteries, cauterizing irons were often sufficient. But for a thigh amputation, where the femoral artery, as thick as a finger, could empty a body in 3 minutes, point cauterization was useless. The vast mass of flesh required a total solution. Only complete immersion in tar guaranteed a seal. Both methods created a physical barrier, but tar was the universal answer to the deadliest injuries, and its effectiveness was hidden not just in its physical properties. The bleeding has stopped. The wound is sealed with a black crust. In a hospital it would be cleaned and bandaged, leaving it vulnerable to infection. But the pirate's wound was hermetically sealed with a substance that didn't just create a barrier, but actively killed microbes. Until now, we've talked about mechanics, speed, tools, and physical isolation. Now, it's time to reveal the chemical secret. The chemical composition of ship's tar and cheap rum explains the paradox with which we began. The pirates were winning the battle against infection without even realizing it. The ship's sealant proved more effective than medical ointments. The logic seems superficial. Tar protects wood from rot, so it will protect flesh too. But the reality was more elegant. Ship's tar contains phenols, such as creosote, and terpenes. These are powerful antibacterial and antifungal compounds, a natural broad-spectrum antibiotic. By pouring sealant on the wound, pirates were unconsciously applying a chemical shield. The irony is that creosote is still used in dentistry today as an antiseptic for root canals. But the chemical defense was only half the story. The other half lay in the fire over which the cauldron boiled. Why was the tar specifically boiled? The obvious answer is to make it liquid so it could fill all the irregularities of the wound. But the numbers tell a different story. The boiling point of pine tar exceeds 200 degrees Celsius, 392 degrees. This is instant and total sterilization, the same principle behind a modern autoclave. Twice as hot as boiling water, this temperature incinerated any microbes on contact. It was a simultaneous chemical and thermal attack on infection, unavailable to hospitals where wounds were washed with cool wine. But there was another ingredient in this devil's cocktail, and it was applied first. The myth is that rum was an anesthetic to help the patient endure the agony. But for surgical anesthesia, its effect was negligible. Its true role was as an antiseptic. The proof of pirate rum, ranging from 50% to 70% ethanol, effectively killed bacteria. It was used to wash the wound, the instruments, and the surgeon's hands. This was a multi-stage system. First, alcohol disinfection, then thermal and chemical sterilization with tar. The theory seems sound, but how can we be sure this isn't just a convenient reconstruction? It's easy to dismiss it all as luck and the robust health of rogues. But the facts refute this. First, archaeology. Skeletons from shipwreck sites show signs of cleanly healed amputations. At the wreck of the Whydah galley, a shin bone was found with a neat surgical cut that had begun to heal. Second, documents. Pirate articles that specified monetary compensation for lost limbs prove that survival was an expected outcome, not a miracle. The system worked, and this brings us to a direct confrontation. It's time to pit the deck of a pirate ship against the best surgical ward in London and find out who wins the battle for life. A pirate who survived an amputation would awaken in agony. By the logic of a cruel world, he had become useless cargo, soon to be thrown overboard. In a society of ruthless egoists, a cripple is a burden. This expectation, this despair, could kill faster than any infection. But reality struck back with its own sense of justice. Pirate articles guaranteed compensation, 600 pieces of 8 for a right arm, 500 for a leg. This was 4 years' salary for a Royal Navy sailor. The pirate did not become an outcast. He remained on the ship, receiving a share and performing what work he could. The image of a pirate with a wooden leg is not a sign of disability, but a symbol of a veteran who received his insurance and remained a valued member of society. The pirate had a motivation to live, but even the strongest will is powerless against the invisible killer that reigned in Europe's best hospitals. How did an educated doctor in a London hospital lose to a semi-literate cook with a carpenter's saw? The answer lies in what the doctors couldn't see: microbes. The hospital seemed like a bastion of safety, beds, care, the best minds. But in reality, it was a breeding ground for death. Dozens of wounded men in one stuffy ward, filthy sheets, and a doctor who, without washing his hands, would move from dissecting a corpse that died of gangrene to dressing a fresh wound. He acted like a dirty sponge, absorbing death from one wound and transferring it to the next. He himself was the weapon. The isolation of a pirate ship in the ocean was its greatest medical advantage. There was no cross-contamination from dozens of other patients. Their environment was paradoxically cleaner. The theory is clear: isolation versus contamination. But what were the real numbers in this deadly race? It is time for the verdict. On one side, official medicine with its false theories of miasmas. On the other, pirates with their system of speed, isolation, and accidental sterilization. In the best hospitals in Europe, the mortality rate after a thigh amputation reached 80%. A shoulder amputation killed 7 out of 10. It was practically a death sentence. There are no precise statistics for pirates, but indirect evidence speaks for itself. Healed bones found at wreck sites, and a compensation system that would have been meaningless if no one survived. Historians estimate the survival rate on pirate ships was over 50%. Their system, based on brutal pragmatism, was objectively better. The chance of surviving an amputation on a rum-soaked deck was higher than in the finest surgical ward in Paris. We have solved the paradox, but this story is not just about pirates. It's about a universal principle that still works today. The mystery is solved, but this is not just an amusing anecdote about lucky rogues. It is a story of how innovation is born from necessity. Doctors and hospitals were constrained by theories and authorities. They couldn't discard what they had been taught. Pirates were free from dogma. They were interested in one criterion: does it work or not? Their system triumphed because it was a product of evolution, not theory. It developed like a riverbed, carving its path of least resistance, leaving only those methods that proved their strength. Every action, from the speed of the saw to the ladle of tar, was honed by harsh practice. In the final part, we will retrace the entire chain of the pirates' brutal logic, so you will change your view of them forever. Let's assemble this entire system to see its iron logic. At its core lay one problem: inevitable death. A cannonball shattered the bone, but the real killer was the forest of wooden splinters that exploded into the hull, turning the deck into a meat grinder. In a world without antibiotics, such a torn, dirty wound was a 100% guarantee of gangrene. Infection was the titan they had to fight. In a matter of days, it turned a strong sailor into a rotting corpse. This pressure created a deadly countdown, the golden hour of trauma, which forced them to cast aside pity and act. The problem was clear: inevitable death. Their answer was mechanical. The second link in the chain was this mechanical response. It combined speed, pragmatic tools, and blood control. The guillotine method, a quick circular cut, was a direct solution to the need for speed. The tools served the same purpose: a coarse carpenter's saw to cut through bone in 3 strokes, and a thin cattling knife to separate the muscles beforehand, forming a proper stump for future life. But all this would have been meaningless without the screw tourniquet. It was this device that gave the surgeon a dry field to work in, turning uncontrolled hemorrhage into a manageable process. The technique, tools, and tourniquet worked as a single, well-oiled machine. The mechanical problem was solved, but the main, invisible threat remained. The third and decisive step was chemical and thermal. This is where their diabolical cocktail came into play. First, rum, which served as a primitive but effective antiseptic for the wound and instruments. Then, a red-hot iron, or even more reliably, complete immersion of the stump in a cauldron of boiling tar. This solved 2 problems at once: the final cessation of bleeding and the total sterilization of the wound at a temperature exceeding 200 degrees Celsius. It was a multi-stage attack: alcohol disinfection, thermal sterilization by fire, and chemical sealing with tar. It was this step, which official medicine did not take, that explains the survival paradox. The system was complete: problem, mechanics, chemistry. And now that we see it in its entirety, a final question arises. We have followed the entire journey, from the horror of the injury to paradoxical survival. We have seen how a system that worked better than official medicine was born from necessity, brutality, and accidental discoveries. Now, the final question for you. Who, in your opinion, was the true innovator of their time, forced to seek truth in extreme conditions? On one hand, the educated doctor, armed with knowledge, but bound by the deadly fallacies of his era. On the other, the pragmatic pirate, ignorant of theories, but creator of a brutal yet functional system based on practice and results. Write just one word in the comments to deliver your verdict: pirate or doctor. And as you write, remember, sometimes the most important discoveries are made not in the quiet of libraries, but in the roar of a storm, when life itself is at stake.